The FIA has updated the sporting and technical regulations for the remainder of 2024, and it seems like we're going to get an even more interesting second half of the season, starting from the braking system update, the tyre testing, as well as penalty application, all the way to the drivers stopping on track during qualifying. These changes will be something that the teams would want to carefully go through before the season continues. The question is, how much can they actually improve in this regard? Formula One is a sport that is, of course, constantly evolving and upgrading, and in 2024 we're going to experience a vast number of changes for the second half of the season, starting with the most important and probably the most interesting one, the braking system, or more precisely, the brake circuits and pressure distribution. The 11.1 change states that any system or mechanism that can produce systematically or intentionally asymmetric braking torques for a given axle is forbidden. Obviously, if a rule like this is implemented, it kind of suggests that a team has found a way outside of the typical front-rear brake bias shifts, which have been previously exploited by the brake magic system of Mercedes. Therefore, a team has definitely done something interesting with their brake maps or braking controls that allow them to improve braking not only front to back, but in the pattern of left front, left rear and right rear, and this is massive for corner performance. Such a typical and explicit mid-season regulation being implemented into the mid-season means one of two things. The FIA either found, observed, or had a report from other teams that a certain team on the grid was doing this as a grey area and considered not to be in the spirit of the regulations, as was the case with the infamous DAS system, or the second choice could be that the governing body had completely missed the regulation on their end, and now they're closing this regulatory loophole, which is now a case of them begging the teams to comply to what needs to be done properly. Furthermore, it's worth noting that teams do modulate on the rear side, specifically with the diffuser and how locked or unlocked it is, but vectored braking is a tool that can be exploited massively by the teams, just like how the diffuser is used to aid in balance and cornering of the car. We should be seeing a lot of changes from practically all of the teams on the grid if this turns out to be true, and it's just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to changes being implemented on the cars in the second half of the season. The Mule car testing, or the TMC 1010, is a significant addition to the regulations, because from now on a team could use a car at any track running time using the cars in compliance or with the current regulations of any of the 4 calendar years that fall immediately prior to the calendar year of the championship, but it's modified for the purpose of providing track testing of future products. This will allow the teams to build cars that are based on the chassis from the current season through the last 4 seasons, which obviously involve the pre-ground effect era, to allow the on-track testing primarily for the upcoming 2026 regulations, as well as understanding how to narrow the gap to Red Bull furthermore in 2024. Obviously, 2026 will be the primary goal, because the teams would now have to understand a lot more in an era that looks to be anybody's guess in terms of development and engine power, and these Mule tests will be really fascinating to watch due to the minimal modifications that the cars are expected to go through for the necessary purpose of testing desired components. Given the fact that teams like Ferrari and McLaren, as well as Mercedes, are not done with the 2024 upgrades, it would be a huge boost for them to be even closer to Red Bull when 2025 starts, as Horner and Verstappen are now adamant that they have reached the ceiling with the RB20 and not a lot of performance is left to be unlocked. A little bit more easily understood rule has also been introduced by the FIA, and that is the carrying over of time penalties. We've seen drivers being penalised multiple times, and when we say drivers, we think primarily of Ocon and Magnussen, but they've been serving them throughout the race, so it wasn't making any difference at all. Now, 5 or 10 second penalties can be carried in the next race if the driver driver is unclassified in the race. Retirement happens, or it's in addition to pit lane drive-throughs or stop and goes. A driver, however, must run more than 90% of the racecourse distance to be considered classified, and this is now definitely deterring the teams to try something cheeky when they're being given a penalty, such as Norris when he served the 5-second penalty before he retired the car in Austria. Another very interesting change is about to happen when a car stops during a qualifying process, and this has been prompted by Carlos Sainz's situation in China. From now on, the 39.6 article says that any driver whose car stops on the track in any other area other than the pit lane during the qualifying session or the sprint qualifying session and receives physical assistance will not be permitted to take any further part in that session. The latter part was already obvious as Perez asked his racing engineer to push his car from the gravel in Silverstone, and Bird told him that this would be considered mechanical assistance and they would be automatically disqualified. To simplify this, if the car stops on track and the driver is able to get it going on his own, then no problems should occur to the qualifying process. And in the previous regulation era, it read that any driver's car stops on track in any other area other than the pit lane during the session, the drivers won't be able to continue with the qualifying process, which is what led Aston Martin to protest these results the most as a team that was heavily affected by it during Saturday's sessions. This is definitely considered a step in the right direction, but there are situations in which sometimes a car stopping in the middle of the road could cause a double yellow flag or a red flag scenario in which the other drivers would be forced to abandon their fast laps. And if the car that stopped on track is able to get running again, the flags would have been practically for nothing. Furthermore, Formula One could look a bit over their shoulder, and in another championship like the IndyCar, where a driver who causes a red flag during qualifying loses their 2 fastest laps, and if he causes a yellow flag, loses one of their fastest laps, while the other drivers can continue without any consequences. These changes are very interesting and will definitely form a very interesting turn of events in 2024, mostly because the majority of them have been happening in the first 14 races, which is why the FIA was more or less prompted to look into changing the rulebook a bit more than usual. Whether or not it would result in better results and better racing, or whether some teams will be exposed by their braking systems, time will tell. As of now, we've seen that Red Bull has protested the legality of McLaren and Mercedes front wings, or more precisely, its flexibilities, which brought to a race full of sensors in Spa on this particular part of the car in order to make sure that everything is smooth running from the Austrian team's fiercest competitors. While this is definitely a step in the right direction, every rule change has its negative opinion and a lot of naysayers, so we would still have to wait and see how the other teams will be in terms of rebellion regarding these changes, and it would be easy to assume that the ones who will protest the most will be the ones who will be affected the most by this bunch of changes. As of now, Red Bull are certain that there are not a lot of changes to the car, even though they will continue with the upgrades, and Verstappen himself is adamant that a scenario like this was to be expected. It's just a surprise that the other teams were able to catch up so quickly to the Austrian squad. Elaborating further on the team's expectation for 2024, Verstappen said, "You are always searching for more performance, but sometimes you have to be realistic. Maybe there isn't more to be found, but it's just trying to stay at that level, even though it's incredibly hard. We are not robots. I know it's tough to not compare ourselves to last year's performance, but it's just how it goes, right? To operate at that level, it's maybe something that we'll look back on in 20 years and everyone may appreciate a little bit more of what we did as a team. For me, even now, maybe we don't have the quickest car. It doesn't really change the mentality. We are always trying to get back to that level." With all this in mind, what do you think these changes will bring to the cars and to the grid in general? And more precisely, do you think that they'll improve the racing experience of all 20 drivers on the grid? Let us know in the comments below, and once you do that, have a look at the video that's appearing on your screen right now.